Hello, Spanish learners. This is the Spanish Code Podcast. I am Christian Robinson, the owner of Spanish Fit. With me, as always, Nelfer Velija, our professor, our head of curriculum at the school, and one of the best professors you will ever meet. Today, we are getting into something really juicy, and it's super, super important. You will never speak Spanish unless your brain, if you allow your brain to accept the concept of conjugation. And why do I say that your brain has to accept it? Because your brain, based in English, unfortunately, doesn't really know what a conjugation is naturally. And why is that? Nelfer, let's look at the English brain. Here we have the present tense of English. I study Spanish. You study Spanish. He studies Spanish. We study Spanish. They study Spanish. We got one error on there. It's intentional. He studies Spanish. Now, Nelfer, do us a favor and just explain for us how important this concept of conjugation is in Spanish.
Yeah, in every language that comes from Latin, like Portuguese, French, Spanish as well, we have this concept of conjugation that we prefer calling codification. This is the way we're going to call it, like you're going to understand why later. But every time we use a verb, an action, we need to change that word depending on the person who's performing the action and when the action is being performed. That's basically the definition of a conjugation.
Right. So basically what Nelfer's saying is that here we have all of our pronouns and we have one little difference, studies. Now that in English is a conjugation. So you do know what a conjugation is. We just don't do it very often. So to give you an example, I study, you study, we study. I used to study. That's the past tense. Study didn't change. I will study. Study didn't change. I would study if I went to school. That's the conditional, and it didn't change. So in Spanish, what Nelfer is saying, this is the present tense. I study becomes estudio. You study, estudias. He studies, estudia. Nosotros, we study, estudiamos. They study, you guys study, estudian. Now, this isn't just 5 different words. This is 5 different endings. So we have o, as, a, amos, an. Okay? But what this means is that that's just the present tense. So for every person, I, and for every time, like every past tense, the conditional, the different moods in Spanish, there's a total of 16 different times and moods in Spanish. So for every single person and every single time or mood, we're going to have a different code. And that's why we call this the Spanish Code. That's why our book is called the Spanish Code. And that's why we like to teach with codes, because codes are fun and they're easy to remember. Whereas when you hear a word like conjugation, you feel like you're back in school and you want to stop learning Spanish. So it just has to be really clear in your head that when we communicate in Spanish, what I hate the most is when someone comes to my school and they've been studying for a year and they say, "Oh, Christian, yo no comer carne." I do not eat meat is what they want to say, but what does that sound like in my Spanish brain? I do not to eat meat. This sounds horrible. So we got to fix this from day one. We're beginners. So Nelfer's going to pull up our graphification of the present tense, and we're going to start with conversations. And how do we have conversations? Hey, Nelfer, ¿cómo estás?
Muy bien, ¿tú cómo estás?
Excelente, man. So we're going to focus on talking for me, and we're going to focus on asking questions to another person, because these are the first steps of having actual communication with another person. All right, let's go.
Yeah, let's say you're learning Spanish and you see a list of 100 verbs that you should know in order to learn. You download it from like internet. And then you see, for example, estudiar, the one we were covering, or comunicar, which is to communicate. And let's say you know that word and then you feel like you can speak because you already know the verb like in English. And then you want to say, I know yo, which is I. And then you want to say yo estudiar. You don't want to sound like a caveman.
Yeah, we're not going to say I to study. No, you're going to say I study. So the difference is that that code that we're going to learn at the end of the verb is actually the pronoun. So when I say, yo no hablo español, that O means I. Oh, okay.
And then, yes, you learn those verbs: practicar, to practice, to visit, to speak, to learn, to read, to drink, to eat, to live. You need to understand that every single verb in Spanish, they have two parts. And this is how you're going to start codificating the words that you're learning. Like estudiar, you have the root, which is the entire word without the ending AR. You have the raíz, which is the root. And then you have the ending, which is, it can be either AR, ER, or IR. This is how you're going to recognize a verb in Spanish with these endings, right?
That's right. So if you look at the left, you can identify that. We have verbs that end in AR, we have verbs that end in ER, aprender, and we have verbs that end in IR. Now, most verbs are actually going to end in AR. Actually, I don't know why. Why is that?
Yeah, they are more regularly. You're going to see the AR and they are regulars, but that's only an evolution of the language.
Okay, but the codification is really easy. So if I say something like, I want 2 dads, the I want, that's the verb that has to be conjugated. All right, so the 2 dads, the infinitive verb, which is the entire verb, we are going to use sometimes. But if I'm talking about I or you or another person and a time, then we're going to always erase those last 2 letters, and we're going to replace those last 2 letters with a new series of codes to indicate what time and what person is performing or performed the action.
And if you're dealing with this for the first time, I always tell my students, you can be as narcissistic as you want. You don't need to deal with all the endings for all people. At the beginning, what you need is to survive. So it's good if you focus on what is necessary for you to provide information about yourself. For example, the conjugation only for the first person singular, which is me, yo, and we did it already. We replace the ending with an O.
O. So A, E, O, U, right? We already did that class, so you might be doing it next. But that sound is going to become really important. So again, we take off the R, the or the ir, and we add O. So yo hablo, yo aprendo, yo escribo, yo vivo, I live in Colombia. And it's that easy, guys. Now, there's going to be irregularities. You might already be confused because you were taught I am good is estoy bien with a Y. Yeah, it's just an irregular ending. You don't need to worry about it. The rest of that verb actually follows the same algorithm. Yo estoy, tú estás. Yo estoy, tú estás. Hablo, hablas. Aprendo, aprendes. So, yeah, there's nothing really too complicated about it. We just will never say yo estudiar. Yo estudio.
For some of you guys, this is going to be easy. You have seen it. And of course, we're going to cover the entire conjugation of the present tense. But there's some pointers that we want to do here in terms of something that you do often in English is putting auxiliary verbs. Maybe you want to say something about this when we create affirmative sentences, negative sentences, and how we ask. But you have 3 ways to build a sentence in Spanish and also in English. You can say, I study, I do not study, and maybe you're drunk and you don't remember and you wonder, do I study? So 3 in the same tense, 3 sentences in the same time. In Spanish, it is going to be like this. If we have hablar, we're always going to have the hablo, the conjugated verb, hablo, hablo, and hablo. But the thing is, we're going to have to put the word no in front when we're creating negative sentences. I do not speak. We don't have the do. And we're going to cover this later, but no hablo. It's only the no in front of the conjugated verb. No aprendo, I do not learn. No escribo, I don't write.
So basically, in Spanish, your Spanish brain, when you think I speak, you say speak I. That's what you basically say. You say no, speak I. You say speak I as a question. And we're going to focus on that word do here in a minute. Actually, let's pull that up.
Yeah, but you can see it here. Sometimes you can structure a sentence in English by saying I speak, or you want to make an emphasis and you say I do speak. We're never going to do that. We don't have this verb in the sentence. It's always going to be one word, hablo. That's why we don't need to say yo all the time. If you want to say I speak, yes, you can say yo hablo. That's optional. But the O is telling that it's myself. So
This is like always a confusing thing in the school because people come to Blink and they learn really, really fast and they learn all the conjugations and then they learn the pronouns. Yo, tú, él, nosotros, ellos, ustedes. And they wonder, why do we need the pronouns in Spanish if it's built into the verb? Well, you need it because, Nelper, ¿hablas inglés?
sí, yo hablo inglés.
And how would you ask me if I speak? ¿Y tú? ¿Y tú? So what he does, instead of asking the whole question again, he says, and you? Okay, just like we would in English. But yeah, there are a lot of times when we do need the pronouns. So they are important to learn and to remember.
That's why we like covering these brains. Like, how do you structure the sentence in English and what's the brain in Spanish? Because often you're going to want to say like, okay, I have 2 words in my brain. I want to say I speak. It's 2 words. So I should translate word by word. Yo hablo, but that's not natural. We say it when we want to make like an emphasis. Yo hablo, like I'm talking about me and you know that I'm talking about me. It's like an emphasis, right? But we prefer for you to stop thinking that way, translating word by word, because when you find something like I don't, you're going to have an extra word here. And then you're going to have to do like, I do not, only no. And when you say, do I speak, do you, you're going to want to put the do there. And we don't do that, right? We only say one word, hablo, do I speak? And we change the inflection in the voice. That's why we have this little guy here, the upside down question mark. We use it, the opening one, because we never know when we're reading philosophy or literature, like official Spanish, if we're reading a question, we don't want to end up and say, oh, it was a question, let me read it again. We prefer to know it, and that's why we use this one. In English, you know it for sure. Right. You know you're reading a question.
Now, a good thing about this is that when you speak Spanish, you're going to make sentences with a lot less words. So if you say, I don't speak Spanish, I do not speak Spanish, that's 5 words. All right. But in Spanish, we're going to just say, no speak I Spanish. And speak I is 1 word. So no hablo español. There you have it. Listo. All right. So, all right. I dance salsa. All right. There's the I. So bailo salsa. You dance salsa. We haven't even talked about this ending, but this is the ending for you, for AR verbs. It's an AS. So it's O-as. That's our second sound. Baila salsa. You dance salsa. Now, if I wanted to say, do you dance salsa? I'm just going to say, you dance salsa. Dance you salsa. Baila salsa as a question. So if I tell you dance and I ask a question, it's the same way. I'm never going to use that word do. Now, just to kind of illustrate this a little bit better, right? Here we have 3 sentences, and they're actually really important. Do you dance? Do you eat meat? Do you do the homework? Now, this shows we have 2 versions of the verb do in English. Now, the ones in red are just simply never going to exist, because what is that word? Can you guys actually think about why do we even use that word? What is it? It's actually called an auxiliary verb. And in English, we do use auxiliary verbs to indicate time, but generally in the past tense. For example, I have eaten. Okay, your brain does know the concept of an auxiliary verb, because what in the world does that have mean? Doesn't mean I have a mouse. No, it's indicating a time. It's indicating something that has been completed. So we do have auxiliary verbs, but this one is never going to exist in Spanish. The second do is actually really important in Spanish. It's important in English. Hacer means to do or make. And so when I say haces la tarea, I'm saying you do, with this version of do, the homework. Haces la tarea. Do you do the homework? And it's just really important to remember, do you, did you, does he, did he, all of these different variations of the word do that just indicate a question, those are the ones that are never going to exist. So just write down in your notes, do you don't exist. Does not exist. but do don't exist. All right, back to the lesson.
Okay, and then like we covered it already, but the second person for you, and this is pretty much like he said, what you need when surviving. Let's say you want to learn Spanish, you have like, you're going to travel in a month, and you know that in 1 month, you're never going to learn Spanish. Like the entire tenses and all the moods and all the people that you need to be speaking about, you want to cover just what is essential to survive. And then you can go, like I said at the beginning, yo, only with me to provide information about you. I need, necesito, I want, quiero. But then if you feel like you need more challenge, you can add the you, tú hablas, tú escribes, tú viajas, etc. So you can start doing it like this. We always recommend to do it like with your hands, like yo hablo, tú hablas, yo como, tú comes. If you can deal with this change, at some point you're gonna be like my sister, oh, maybe I need another ending. When you start suspecting like this, it means that you're prepared for learning the rest of the conjugations.
I think where Nelver's going with this is actually a super important thing. Most of you who are watching this are learning Spanish on your own. All right, so you probably are gonna be using like flashcards. All right, so we have a new verb that I'm learning, viajar. Okay, if I'm gonna practice and actually remember my conjugations, I'm going to take off my AR, and I have the I and I have the U. So I'm going to say, yo viajo en Colombia, tú viajas en Asia, right? And I'm going to keep doing that so that when I hear a new verb, it ends with AR, and I want to say, you travel, you work, trabajas, us. Yo trabajo, tú trabajas, yo trabajo. With repetition, guys. Because you're going to have to learn all of the conjugations. But right now, we're just going to start out with I and you.
Yeah, and then you can add a little bit more information. After you conjugate the verb, you're allowed to use more words, like depending on the context. Like in affirmative one, yo estudio mucho. I study a lot. You can remove the yo, but if you want to make the emphasis, it's possible. It's always optional to put it. A negative sentence, make sure you always practice afirmativo, negativo, and the questions. Yo no como carne, probably something that you might use if you're a vegetarian, right? I do not eat meat. Oh, lo siento, no como carne. If you're in a restaurant, probably you're going to need this sentence. And questions, trabajo aquí, do I work here? But it's going to be more effective to practice this with the second person. Like, do you work here?
All right, guys. So the big thing today that we want to help you absorb is that because in English, we almost never conjugate. I study, we study, you study, it's study, study, study. You have to remember, in Spanish, we are always going to conjugate. And that's why we don't need pronouns in Spanish. We don't need to say I. We don't need to say we. We don't need to say they. So let's take a look at the entire conjugation. So basically, we know most verbs end in an AR. It's your most common kind of verb. And this is your present tense codification of AR verbs in the present. I hablo. You hablas. He speaks. Él habla. We speak. Hablamos. They speak, or you guys speak. Hablan. All right, now that codification is going to continue unique for AR verbs through the entire grammar of Spanish. So it's something that we're always going to have to do. We're always going to have to learn the new endings for the verbs to speak Spanish. Now, on the other side, ER verbs and IR verbs are like almost identical cousins in Spanish. They have a nearly identical code through the entirety of the grammar, the present tense, the past tense, everything. So we're going to take off our ER or take off our IR. I aprendo. Tú aprendes. Él aprende. Nosotros aprendemos. Aprendemos. Y ustedes and you guys aprenden. And IR is almost identical. There's only one little difference here. The ER for we and the IR for we become dominant. So nosotros aprendemos with an E, but if we're writing or living, escribimos, vivimos. So yeah, that's your entire present tense. Now there's going to be some irregularities. You already know a couple of them because you say, yo soy Cristian. That's the verb ser. We don't take off the ER and say, yo so Cristian, unfortunately, but it's just an irregular verb. So when you hit those irregular verbs, you just have to remember, I have to memorize each version of that verb. Listo.
Okay.
Vamos.
Yeah, the only thing that you can do is when you have a list of verbs like the one we showed you before, this one, you can practice every day with this. Like you need to make this process like automatic in your brain, removing the ending and putting the one depending on the person, again, who's performing and when the action is being performed. The way you did it, right?
Yeah, I mean, also, I'll go through this list right here, but in our next lesson, you guys are going to learn what we call interrogatorios. We're gonna teach you guys some question words, right? But if you have a list, write down a list in your notebook and just go through there knowing I have to erase the last two letters, and to say I do it, I have to add O. Estudio, comunico, practico, visito, hablo, aprendo, leo, bebo, como, vivo. Right? And now you have the two endings. We know that the ending for you is different, but we're going to have to watch how that verb ends. Estudias, comunicas, practicas, visitas, hablas, aprendes, aprendes, lees, bebes, comes, vives. Listo. So with new lists of verbs, you should go through both pronouns. And Nelfer and I are going to have a little conversation right now, just using tu and yo for the verbs on the board. Okay, Nelfer, ¿por qué visitas a mi hermana? Nelfer, why do you visit my sister?
Yo no visito a tu hermana.
En serio?
Claro que no. ¿Por qué tú llamas a mi madre?
Yo llamo a tu madre porque es muy linda. Because she's super hot. Okay, y Nelfer, ¿aprendes otro idioma?
Sí, aprendo portugués.
Okay, I asked him, do you learn another language? Yes, I learn Portuguese. ¿Lees novelas románticas?
No, no leo novelas románticas. Normalmente leo ficción.
Muy bien. Leer, to read. So I said, Nelfer, do you read romantic novels? He said, no, I prefer ficción. You guys didn't know. Nelfer is an award-winning author here in Colombia. Como domar la miseria is the name of his book, if you guys can look for that.
Sort of the, yeah, kind of.
What's your book about, Nel?
Yeah, useless ways of taming miseries, about the violence in Colombia here. We had a history, you know, and it's almost about this farmers like fighting against the government, and then a lot of people like having to do something in this fight, and yeah, it's a lot of pessimism on that.
So anyway, Nelfer's book is available on Amazon. It's not really for your guys' level. We probably need to get you up to like B2 before you start reading in Spanish, but it's cool that I get to hang out with a famous guy. Que bebes. So que, what? Que bebes?
Bebo mucha agua.
He drinks a lot of water. Bebes aguardiente.
Sí, bebo mucho aguardiente también.
¿Y dónde vives? ¿Dónde vives, Nelfer?
Vivo en Envigado, cerca de Medellín, close to Medellín.
Okay.
Yeah, when you ask, of course, you don't need to repeat the verb, but if you want to make some emphasis or you want to say no, do you drink like wine? And then you want to say, no, I drink another thing like beer. Then you use the verb, right?
No, babe.
And that's a good practice that you need to do all the time. And then when you master this, like exchanging the person and the conjugation, it's going to be easier to get the rest.
All right, guys, that is it for today. Please remember to like, subscribe, and leave us comments below. Also, for a lot of our podcasts, we have some information below that you can download. Other than that, we will be back very soon to cover another great topic in the Spanish grammar. And we might even answer your questions and do a video just for you. So until then, hasta pronto, alumnos.
Nos vemos.